Hi, everybody. So my name is Fanny Lalot. I am a PhD student at the University of Geneva. I am in charge of representing the lab here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to present some of the work I've been doing as part of my thesis under the supervision of Juan Manuel Falomir and in collaboration with Alain Quiamzade. So in this work, we investigate the impact of majority and minority support, social support, for some values on individual behaviors. So what we aim at doing in this work is to draw from and build from Moscovici's conversion theory and investigate really what it means to be part of a majority or a minority as opposed to being confronted to a minority or majority position. So we're trying to link some social influence theories with motivational processes and behavior. And you'll see in the study I'm going to present that we had some interest for environmentalism. As it is for us, I'm sorry, it's not supposed to be that big. The perfect example of a successful active minority. Because environmentalism, I have trouble with this word, started back in the 70s as a really minority movement, and it's amazing how in just a few decades it really became the new majority norm. So it's a very interesting topic to investigate when you're looking at majority and minority influence. We've heard quite a lot already about minority influence, so I will be short, but just to sum up, the idea behind the conversion theory is that, of course, a majority has powers, can put some normative pressure on the individual, so the individual is likely to conform to the majority norm. But because it's involved in a social comparison process, most of its attention is focused to the source and not the message itself, which results to a more manifest and public influence and no long-term or latent influence. And on the other hand, a minority do not have those powers, but can induce conflict and show that other possibilities exist. And because there's no threat for the individual, he's more likely to engage in a validation process where more attention is allocated to the message and not the source itself. And this, in turn, leads to more latent and private and long-term influence. And of course, we do know today that things can be more complex than that, and then majorities can also have some latent influence. But for the sake of my talk today, we can just stay on that perspective. Then, most of the conversion theory was really focusing on an individual facing a minority or majority that was trying to change their opinion. And what interested us was more the meaning of being part of a majority or minority for the individual. So we tried to draw from Moscovici's insight and expand the theory a little bit to move to majority and minority support for the individual position. So what does it mean? First, being part of the majority, it's going to be the situation for every normative value. So, for example, ecology nowadays, it's widely accepted that we should do something for the earth, etc. So most people are actually part of the majority supporting this position. But we do know from psychology that attitudes don't necessarily translate into action. We have this gap between attitude and behavior. So agreeing with the majority position would not necessarily mean that the people are going to act according to those positions. And what we thought is that people would actually just adopt enough normative behavior to make sure they comply with the majority's position, which would correspond to a manifest influence or conformism. And to draw a link with a motivational theory, that would be the equivalent to a minimal standard, which is a goal of intermediate level, but which really has the form of an obligation. It's a goal people absolutely want to reach. But once it's reached, once the people have been able to prove they are consistent with the majority position, they are complying with that, they don't have any more motivation to go further. So then we would observe a reduction of effort, a sort of slacking off. And so this is where the effect of self-licensing or compensation would be more likely. So people would first try to conform with the majority, and once that's assured, they would let it go. And on the other hand, being part of a minority would be very different for the individual. We know very well that to have an impact, a minority needs to be active and to be promoting his position and to be non-compromising. And that implies that its members need to be active and to actively promote the minority's positions and values. So we felt that being part of a minority will have this energizing effect on its member to push them to carry forward and try to promote those positions, those values. So in that situation, we'll be observing something was closer from theories of consistency. So the more the members act, the more likely they are to pursue in that direction in the future. And again, to go back to motivational theories, that would be the equivalent of a maximal standard, so a higher goal, a type of ideal goal that people don't necessarily expect to reach, but they're trying to go closer and closer to that goal. So in this perspective, minority could have two powers. First, to influence others outside the minority, and we know for that there is this need of a conflict, but also to energize their own members, even in the absence of a conflict of opinion. To sum up, so we had those two hypotheses that we then try to test. So first, when a person benefits from a minority support, they would try to pursue the related goal in the long run. So the more they act towards reaching the goal, the more motivated they would be to carry on in the future. And on the other hand, when a person benefits from a majority support, they would first try to conform a minimum to the goal of the majority. And then when they believe that the past behavior is enough to ensure a normative compliance to the group, they would slack off and reduce their effort. And so we test that in a set of study, which result I would present briefly. So we had 3 studies where we investigate the combined effect of social support and past behavior on the engagement in further behavior. And we try to change a little bit the way we were manipulating or measuring each variable. So social support in 2 studies, we very explicitly manipulated and indicated it, and it was the usual 82 versus 18%. That were used in a lot of studies. So we just tell people, well, there's been a recent opinion poll, and it appeared that a majority or a minority of people are actively supporting the environmental value in data. And in the first study, we just measure it. So we ask people, according to you, what percentage of people is actively supporting the pro-environmental value? For past behavior, in the first study, we just assessed participants' green and non-green habits. So that was with a 50-item scale, if I'm not mistaken. In another study, we manipulate those past behaviors. So we use a quite subtle attitude inference procedure. So we manipulate the frequency adverbs within the question that we ask people. So it was more or less easy to present oneself as a very green person or not. And in the first study, we went very explicit and obvious and just provide people with a bogus feedback that would tell them, well, given what you told us about your daily life habits, we can tell you that you are below or above the certain recommendations of the National Office of Sustainable Development, so you're doing well enough or you're not doing well enough. And finally, we observe what impact those variables had on 3 different things. So first, the endorsement of a green collective action. There was a green Christmas, so trying to have a more sustainable Christmas regarding gifts and wrapping gifts and Christmas trees and all that. And also how willing people would be to personally engage in another collective action, which was this time a zero power day, so trying to have near zero energy consumption for one day. And finally, whether or not people were willing to sign a couple of petitions that were running at the moment. So what we found in the first study, so you have here the self-reported green behavior, minus and plus 1 standard deviation, and the condition of minority and majority support, and that's how much they endorse the collective action. And first, we have this positive link in the minority support condition. So when people believe it's only a minority, supporting the green values, the more they are actually doing in their daily life, the more willing they are to continue in this study, the more they endorse this new collective action. And this link is not significant in the majority condition. And also, we have the difference among people with the less green habits. For those people, when we tell them, well, it's a majority of people who support ecology, that put them in a deviant position because they're not doing what the majority does or expect them to do. And because they're threatened, they tend to endorse the collective action more than in the minority support condition when this threat is not present. And then, of course, we would have expected the same difference reversed among people with the more green habits. So minority should be higher than majority, but that was not significant in that study. Our explanation for that is that it's just self-reported, so we don't know for sure what is the threshold for each individual, at what specific point do they think they've done enough. And that could be a bit different for everybody. So that adds noise in the data, and we're not able to observe this reduction. This is also why in the further studies, we move towards a more manipulated version of the personal behavior. So in the second study, there was the no credential condition. No credential, the items are written in a way that it's very difficult to present oneself as very green and pro-environmental person. Credential condition, it's more easy. To make it more concrete, that would be, for example, no credential condition. At home, I always recycle paper. You always have one piece of paper that you did not recycle, so you cannot put the very high, the higher number on the scale. And credential condition would be at home, I sometimes recycle paper. And that's really easy to say, oh, yes, sure, I do that all the time. And so, again, we have an effect of minority support. So people who are pushed to consider themselves as more pro-environmental would then be more willing to participate in the collective action in the minority support condition when they think it's only a minority who support the environmental value. And that's not the case in the majority support. And then again, we have a difference in the no credential conditions. So when people think maybe they're not doing enough, they are more threatened in the majority support condition, so they try to compensate for their initial lack of behavior as compared to the minority condition. And we have this time the reverse pattern in the credential condition. So when people think they're doing enough, that would motivate them in the minority condition and make them reduce their effort in the majority condition. And in the last study, we really have the same pattern of result. So this is the probability to sign at least one of the 3 petitions we offer them. So this is dichotomous, that was dichotomous score. So 0 and 1 is the probability to sign. You have here the estimate social support from 10 to 100%. That's participants estimate themselves, and a negative and positive feedback condition. So we tell them that their actual behavior were enough to comply with the majority norm or were not enough. And again, we have the same pattern. So the left part of the graph, which represent the people believing in a minority support, you can see that the positive feedback would really lead them to sign the petition much more than the negative feedback. And this pattern reversed for people who believe in a majority support. They would sign the petition much more after receiving a negative feedback than after a positive feedback. Okay, so in conclusion, with this set of study, we demonstrate that being part of a majority versus minority really impacts people's willingness to act in interaction with the past behavior. So majority will first induce conformism and then compensation and reduction of effort when people think they've done enough. And on the other hand, a minority support has this type of energizing effect on the people who are already engaged a little bit, who have done some effort in the past or at least received positive information about that. So we try to offer a prolongation of the conversion theory by moving from pure minority influence to minority support. And just as a conclusive note, it's also something we've been thinking about since the beginning. It's very paradoxical to think that a minority who's successful because it was active and everything will grow and gain so much member that after a while it can become the new majority. That's what happened with ecology. And from what we know from about minority and majority influence, by becoming a majority, you really lose some potential of real influence. So it's a bit tricky to think, what should a minority do to gain recognition, gain power, gain new members, but still has this potential of having real latent influence? And I think Moscovici saw that problem, because that's a quote from an interview he gave in 2000, when he said the environmental movement should regard itself as a minority. It's not just a matter of number, it's how you consider the group, and it's really more powerful if people still believe they are a minority. And that's all for me. Thank you for your attention.